everyone. I am Jeetu Patel. I am the Senior Vice President and General Manager of the Collaboration and Security business at Cisco. And with me, I have one of my good friends and one of the great thinkers in the industry, Phil Libin, who is now the CEO of mmhmm and All Turtles, but also was the co-founder and CEO of Evernote prior to that. And so has done some great work in this world, in the world of productivity. So Phil, welcome. I'm excited to talk to you.
Thank you. I was looking around to see who you were talking about as a great thinker, but I think it's just the two of us here, so we'll muddle through.
You're too modest. But hey, you are onto some pretty cool stuff at mmhmm and All Turtles, and you started a company in the midst of a pandemic. And you currently are, in the conversations we've had, you live right now in Arkansas, and you've rented an Airbnb in Arkansas. So what's it like to start a company in the middle of a pandemic, be hanging out in Arkansas, and doing a tech company?
It's great, I guess. Yeah, we started in May, right? So just really kind of near the beginning, a couple of months into lockdown, and we were, for the first couple of months, we all, started working distributed, working from home in March, and for the first couple of months, like it wasn't boring because it was really terrifying, right? We were all like scared, and at least when you're scared, like you're not bored. But then, a few months into it, like by May, everything just became tedious, and everything we were doing on video was just lame. And so we just started goofing around. It really just started as a joke to just make people better on video, and then turned into a real product pretty quickly. And we called it mmhmm because it started as a joke, so it was kind of a jokey name, but it stuck. And everything's been pretty great since. It's been really interesting, going fully distributed, moving away from San Francisco, hiring a bunch of people, but we've managed to be really productive. And in fact, we're never going back. We're never going back to an office. We decided a few months ago that we just learned too many things, too many superpowers of being distributed, that it's worth keeping.
So you're gonna stay completely distributed throughout. You're not going back to the office. You'll go back. You'll probably get together every so often, physically, but that's not going to be where you spend 90% of your time, is the way that you folks are thinking about it, is it?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people are, when they're kind of thinking about distributed work, they focus on the problems. They're focused on like problem solving. Being on video isn't as good as being in person on this thing, and how do we make up for that? And it's not as good on this thing. And what we found is like, the problem solving is interesting, but actually like focusing on the superpowers is really good. Like there is new stuff that we can do. We have superpowers as a distributed company that we never had before, that are ridiculously better than what we had before. And there's a lot of problems, but the superpowers are worth fighting for. And they're worth like solving the problems because we never want to give up the superpowers. And so like, 20% of the time figuring out how to solve problems, 80% of the time figuring out how to like lean into the superpowers, I think is like a healthy mix. And obviously, like it doesn't mean, like we actually avoid saying remote. There's a lot of talk of like remote work and remote companies, and like we're not remote. We kind of have a rule, in fact, that like no one is remote, because I think like when you think about remote, like it conveys this kind of idea, right? It's like remote is about loneliness. It's like, if a bunch of people are working in the office but you're not, then you're remote and you're in a disadvantage. And so like no one's remote. We're all distributed, and we're kind of leaning into that. And being remote doesn't mean that you never see other people. Of course you do. Of course we like get together. Of course we do all these other things, but we do them because we're trying to preserve the superpowers that we have as a team because we're remote.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting kind of construct of how humans are going to kind of evolve over the course of the next decade or two as a result of this kind of very large social experiment that we ran and are still running actually throughout the world. The thing that we've at least thought about is, in a lot of instances, these virtual meetings can be 10x better than in-person interactions. And one of the things that we found is that doesn't mean that all interactions are going to be virtual, because there'll be some interactions they make a lot of sense to be in person. And when those interactions happen in person, you want to make those 10x better as well. But there will be scenarios where virtual interactions will actually be much higher bandwidth and much better, not just because you can't get to the physical place, but it's because those just get to be better, because that's a better way to go out and communicate. You know, you can't do half the things if you're just physically sitting across from each other. You know, from a overall storytelling, even the things that you just did right now, which were kind of aids that you had to what you were talking about, which is a very masterful way of showing your product demo while you're doing it. We are running on WebEx, sitting on top of WebEx, and we're actually having this conversation. And you were able to
Yeah.
show, you know, kind of certain pieces, which is the magic of this whole thing, is that there's an ecosystem that's just going to go out and build experiences that weren't possible in the past.
Yeah, I think there's like the way that we think about it is it's about intentionality.
Yeah.
All of us for the past, year, 14 months, like we've been working distributed. We've been on video because we had to be. We were forced to be. And now we're making the transition of doing it from because we had to be. Now, as the world starts opening up, we can decide what did we learn from being on video. Then now that we're not forced to do it, what do we want to keep doing because we want to do it? Like we have the agency, we have the intentionality, and it's a completely different feeling, right? Like being forced to do something because you have to is always going to feel different than choosing to do something once you kind of know, what you're doing.
That's exactly right.
And I think this is the big transformation in the world. Is like many of us, there's going to be now a few 100 million people globally that are like making the transition of like, well, we were forced to do something and it sucked, but it sucked because we were forced to do it. But now we're not forced to do it. We're going to keep the good parts and get rid of the bad parts. And
Actually,
it's like that changes everything.
Deep, but I agree with you completely. And there's an even deeper point to it, which is there's about 3 billion digital workers on the planet. About a billion of those right now are knowledge workers. 2 billion are frontline and field workers. And if you think about those 3 billion workers today, opportunity for those 3 billion workers is very unevenly distributed throughout the planet. If you live in a village in Africa or a village in India, you would have a very different level of access to opportunity than someone in Silicon Valley. And I think, like, I was an immigrant in this country, 30 years ago. And had I not come to America, my life would actually have been very different. And I don't think that should be the case. Like, you should not have to immigrate somewhere in order for you to have access to economic opportunity. And so what this technology can do is literally level the playing field in a way that historically was just not possible because people didn't believe it was. And now geography is no longer something that we should hold as a coveted advantage, but should be something that's just a thing that, like, all we have to overcome is, get pinned to time zones. And once you get pinned to a time zone, it doesn't really matter where you work. You should be able to work and be able to engage with people. And then when you want to work together, you should have great experiences physically as well. But those should not be a necessity for people being able to get access to opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I'm an immigrant too. Had I not immigrated to the U.S., more than 30 years ago now.
Where'd you come from? I didn't know that.
But not just the U.S. Yeah. I was born at a very young age in what used to be the Soviet Union.
Where were you born?
Used to be called Leningrad.
At the very young age.
It used to be called Leningrad. Now it's St. Petersburg. And I came over when I was 8. But also like moving to Silicon Valley was a big difference, and that shouldn't matter either.
It shouldn't.
Our core philosophy at All Turtles is this, right? Is that like we want exceptionally talented people. Yeah. But like exceptional talent is exceedingly rare by definition. It wouldn't be exceptional if it wasn't rare, but it's evenly distributed.
Sure.
Like there are exceptionally talented people geographically evenly distributed in the world. They're like mushrooms, right? They just like sprout out at random. Yeah. But if they happen to sprout out, within 50 miles of Stanford, they get a lot of opportunities. And if they happen to spread out like in most other places in the world, like people don't know what they are and they get trampled on. And that's just bad for the world. Like forget about being unfair. It's just bad outcomes. So we absolutely like want exceptionally talented people everywhere to have the same opportunities to be fully productive, because that's how all of us are going to move forward.
And one of the things that I found is it's not only good for the people to get access to opportunity, but frankly, it's great for companies because now all of a sudden you have this very broad aperture that you can have on where you can go out. You could cast a very wide net, and anywhere in the world, if you've got talent, that person could be working with you, solving a very important problem. And I just think that the next generation should not experience, or the day forward from here on out on our clock, people should not experience this kind of massive constraint that's geography bound. We should also make sure that it's not the same massive constraint that's language bound over time, and a massive constraint that's going to be personality type bound if you're an introvert or an extrovert, or a massive constraint that's tech proficiency bound. Like those are all things that are constraints there now that are almost arbitrary in nature that you should just not have, as you move forward.
And even the time zones.
Even time zones, yeah. Time zones is a really interesting one because I think this notion of sync and async, in my mind, is so important, and not just making sure that all communications get to be synchronous communications. And in fact, you and I have talked about this before, and you're doing some interesting work there. We're doing some interesting work. But this whole notion of kind of always being available together at the same time so that you can go out and get a conversation of high bandwidth exchanged just seems like a very counterproductive, limiting way to go out and not scale. And so
exactly.
So tell me a little bit more in that area and what you folks are thinking about for the async world, the kind of side of the world.
Yeah, this is one of the other giant superpowers, right? It's like the ability to bend time.
Yeah.
The idea is, you should. We have a general philosophy on all this, which to me, is it's kind of almost biblical. It's do what works best. It basically means that you should do in person the stuff that is best in person, and you should do online the stuff that's best online, right? It's almost like render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and etc. So you don't have to pick, right? You can do both, and this is for the first time ever. So every single interaction, every single transaction, you can pull it apart and you can decide which of these parts is better to do in person, which of these parts is better to do synchronously live, which of these parts are better to do asynchronously and or online. And you don't have to make those decisions on a compromise. You can make it based on what's best for each thing. So for example, in the before times, right, before the pandemic, all of these were always tied together based on what you had to do. So if you were in a college class, college classes were live and synchronous, right? They were synchronous, they were in person. You're all to sit there at the same time. But now you can pull that apart. So let's say you're in medical school. Well, the lecture portion of the class, when you are receiving information from the professor, that's obviously going to be better. Right, that's obviously going to be better async and online because you don't all have to wake up at the same time. You don't all have to be in Boston. It's going to be more accessible. It's going to be higher quality. You don't have to take notes and worry that you're going to miss something because
and you can pause, you can rewind, you can listen to it again, those kind of things. Yeah.
You can listen to it at twice the speed or half the speed. If you have a language barrier, you can adjust it. Obviously the actual ingestion of facts, you should do asynchronously. But then the discussion, the Q&A, probably is best to do still online, but synchronously. So you can kind of do what we're doing now. We're bouncing off of each other, right?
Yeah.
But then when you have to do a lab, or you have to see patients, or cut up a cadaver or something, that you have to come in and do it in person. So you take something like a medical school education and you say, well, okay, what parts of it are better asynchronously and online? Which parts of it are better synchronously and online, and which parts of it are better in person? And you don't have to do all three parts on the same day. You can split them up, and the result is a higher quality education that also happens to be much more accessible, much more affordable, available to much more people. So this is the superpower of breaking that up. I kind of see it almost as
go.
I mean, I think this is a very Cisco thing. I think the last time I lived through anything like this level of world transformation was .com, was the internet. When I started my first company, it was in 1997, and we used to run around saying .com, everything was going to be .com, and I remember getting into arguments with people where they were like, yeah, but what percentage of companies do you think are going to wind up eventually being connected to the internet? And some people were like, up to 25% of all companies are going to be connected to the internet. And other people were like, oh, that's crazy. It won't be more than 2%. And we were like, we think it's going to be 100%. And right, and it was 100%. And like Cisco was one of the main companies that like made that possible. Like you basically connected everything to the internet so that like it enables all this stuff. It underlies just about every transaction. It was an almost complete rewrite for the world. Yeah. In some ways much better, in some ways worse, but for the most part, I think much better. And this is a similar thing, this rewrite of being able to say, we can now break apart live and record it, synchronous and asynchronous, online and in person. We can split those. And we can do in each one what's best done in each one. Yeah. Is like, I think, an even more profound change and requires the next level of infrastructure and applications to do that, which, obviously you're working on it with a lot more resources. And I'm really glad that Cisco's working on it, because you were one of the companies that, that brought the last big change to the world.
We're pretty obsessed about it. And I do think this mixed mode is actually the possibilities in mixed. Firstly, mixed mode is more complicated to think through on how the patterns are going to work and how the human brain is going to get rewired into thinking that mixed mode is the way to do things. So I think there's a learning curve for sure. But the beauty about it is when you start getting used to it and you say, okay, so like, for example, when I joined Cisco, I decided, like, I joined Cisco during a pandemic. So I changed jobs during a pandemic. You started a company during a pandemic. I've barely met any of the people physically at Cisco at all. And it's been 9 months that I've been in the company. I've met Chuck, who's my boss, like 3 times. We talk every day, but I've seen him physically 3 times. And
I mean, you and I have probably like been in person more just because we've known each other for a few years.
That's exactly. Absolutely been more than, I've seen you.
I haven't met half the company.
I've seen Chuck.
Half the company I've never seen in person.
Yeah, and it's actually what was interesting was when when I started, I'm like, I'm going to go out and do a listening tour with people, and large company is a lot of people, so that I have like 15,000 people in my org, and so I'm like, I need to make sure that I get input from people, and so what I did was I said, I'm going to issue a survey. But then I'm also going to make sure that we have some degree of exchange one-on-one, or not one-on-one, but in person in a synchronous meeting. And so we had a survey for async, but then we had this meeting we did, and I met about 1,000 people in the first 30 days in groups of people, but small groups of 8, 10 people, right?
Yep.
And I recorded every single meeting. And the beauty about that was that synchronous communication became async consumption for many other team members of mine, that then were able to view the recording, digest from that what they needed to, and then actually initiate or connect with people that they needed to, either synchronously or asynchronously. So it just became this kind of magical thing that just didn't exist in the past.
Yeah. And I think easier to understand. I think like, in some ways it's harder to wrap your brain around this change because it's a change. But if you focus on, the superpowers, like it's easy to understand, right? So just like, for example, 0% of our employees waste time sitting in traffic and commuting. 0%. Everyone understands that, right? Everyone intuitively understands the idea that you used to spend 2 hours a day and now you don't. And that's a superpower, and that's worth fighting for. And like, imagine if things were backwards, right? Imagine if like, it was always like this, like for the past 20 years, like 0% of the people in my company, like somehow magically, Harry Potter style, like no one wasted time sitting in traffic and commuting. And then, tomorrow I walk into the office and I'm like, hey, everyone, like, hey, gather around. I've got a new management idea. I'm going to need all of you to spend 2 hours every day sitting in traffic. And like, yes, it's super non-productive and you can't work. And yes, you're not spending time with your family. And yes, it's like very stressful. And yes, it's horrible for the environment. And it's just generally very bad for you. But, we're just going to need everyone to waste 2 hours every day commuting, right? Like my board would be like, oh, CEO's gone crazy. And like, I'd be fired immediately. But like, that's kind of what that's what we all used to do. And obviously some people in some companies will still need to do that, because for some things you need to be in person and you should do those in person. But for a lot of things you don't. And like keeping the clarity of like, well, wait, why are we doing this? Right. So that 0% of my employees have to waste time commuting. Like that's a, everyone gets that superpower. That's pretty clear. And that's just one. There's many others that are just as big.
Yeah, and the way that we think about it is, look, the way we think of it is the future of work will definitively be hybrid. Some days people are going to work from home. Some days they might choose to go in the office. Some days they might work from a Starbucks locally. And
Hmm.
uh, what you have to do is construct an environment when that happens. Firstly, there's no second class citizens, that everyone
Right.
feels like they have an equal voice and a seat at the
No
table.
one is remote.
No
Right.
one, yeah, no one's
None of
remote.
this.
That I love that idea. No one's remote, and it clicks even better the second time you said it than the first time when you're saying it in this context. And then the second thing is, um, as we're doing this kind of whole notion of everyone's got an equal seat at the table, can you really think of the best ways to optimize? Like, if you think about the day that we have right now, one of the side effects of COVID has been people are feeling more burned out. They are feeling more fatigued at times. And the reason for that is we have just taken the commute time that you said you saved, and everyone's just doing 8, 10, 12 hours in front of the computer, and that can be fatiguing. And so what do you do? Well, one of the things you could do is carve out some time so you can do some of those meetings async. The second thing you
Hmm.
can do is make sure that you've digested, thought about that a little bit, and then do come together for synchronous communications. Sometimes you might
Yeah.
actually get together in the office. And in all of those areas, it should just fluidly flow from one mode to the other, where it doesn't
Yeah.
become a jarring effect. And I think that,
And
go,
go out to eat and like take a
and
vacation
go
and
to,
like
yeah,
again like we were all it's not that we're just exhausted from working from home, we're also exhausted from never leaving home.
yes,
So like now as soon as we can start leaving home again, like I'm still going to work from home, but it doesn't mean I'm going to go to restaurants, I'm going to take trips. Like I think a lot of the exhaustion is also from like we've all been imprisoned for the past, not all but a lot of us, for the
yeah,
past 14 months. So it like
yeah, yeah.
going from you're doing it because you have to do it to you're doing it because you want to do it, like that changes a lot.
So walk me through, in your mind, the top five in this world that you and I are living in right now, which is how do people communicate and connect with each other and have high bandwidth communication going back and forth. Top 4 or 5 things that you think are going to structurally change in the next decade or two.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is you're totally right about it. It's this, right? Is that everything is hybrid. This is the driver of the world. Meaning,
Yeah.
you can now do things the way that they're best done without trying to recreate, the old reality. And I think that pattern like repeats itself a lot. I think what winds up happening is whenever there's like a massive, whenever there's a really big change in the world, the first thing that happens is people try to like recreate the old reality that they're familiar with.
Mm.
Um, imagine like the first, I don't know, like the first movies, right? Like the very first films, when films were first invented, they didn't understand cinema yet because they just invented the camera. But their old reality was like a theater, so they understood actors on a stage, right? So the first like movies were, a fixed camera pointing at a stage with some actors awkwardly doing stuff, and it was super weird. And I'm sure there was like a lot of critics in 1912 or whatever that were like, this newfangled cinema is like a horrible substitute for theater. It'll never replace theater. Theater is a much better experience. And like, yeah, they're right, because what they didn't understand is like they hadn't invented cinema yet. It took a
Yeah.
few decades for people who were native to this to figure out like close-ups and multiple cameras and editing, and to realize that like, yeah, movies weren't a replacement for cinema. They
Yeah.
were an
Oh,
entirely
for
different
theater.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, for theater, right? They were an entirely different thing, and much bigger overall. But like theater is still around, and
Yeah.
then but that happens every single time, right? Like when I was at Evernote, we were getting started with Evernote. The big change was mobile, was smartphones. 2007, 2008. Now, like all of a sudden, a lot of people had smartphones, but no one knew what a smartphone experience app was going to be like. And so the incumbent players tried to recreate the old reality, which was PC software. So the big companies like Microsoft and whatever said, well, okay, we don't know what smartphone software is like, but we know what PC software is like. It's like Microsoft Word. And a smartphone is really just like a shrunken down PC. So maybe like smartphone software is going to be a smaller version of Microsoft Word. And that's understandable, but it wasn't, right? It took like the native generation of Evernote and Uber and Airbnb and Box to like figure out, okay, um, actually smartphone experiences aren't replacements for PCs. They're a different thing. And they became, 100x more prominent and bigger, but they didn't replace it. Like you still have PCs and Macs.
Yeah.
And now that's happening again with video, right? Like a lot of the incumbent thinking is trying to recreate the old reality in the new technology. Like the old reality was meetings, right? So like, okay, so what were meetings? Well, meetings were like a bunch of boring people who were kind of tired because they had just spent time in traffic and they were all sitting in the same room talking about something boring for an hour. But last year they couldn't, all be in the same room because of COVID. So how do we get as close as possible to a bunch of tired, boring people sitting in the same room talking about something boring, but on a computer? And like, yeah, that's what you got. That's understandable. And then obviously the reaction to that is, oh man, video meetings are such a poor replacement for in-person meetings. Of course they are, because that's not the point. The point isn't to recreate. It's not a replacement for meetings. The point is to invent an entirely new thing. And when you need to have meetings in person, do them in person. But there's so many things that actually meetings sucked for. It's not like people were in love with meetings before COVID. Like how do you get rid of as many meetings? Exactly as you said. Like how do you shift from doing everything synchronously to doing things, asynchronously? How do you make sure that you're only doing the really the human stuff, the discussion stuff synchronously, and everything else you're doing asynchronously because it's like much better. How do you reconfigure the world? And I think we're going to be going through like the next decade, and really by decade I mean like 3 years because things move faster now. Decades go by much faster now than they used to. It's going to be everyone figuring this out.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be I know that you feel pretty optimistic about it. I feel pretty optimistic too. It's frankly going to be a way better. I can imagine a way better world 10, 15 years out than what I see today, because of a couple of big reasons. One is I think people will have a better way to utilize the time that they spend working than the way that they do today. So that's one. Is you're going to get more out of every minute that you spend. Number two is you'll be able to do it from anywhere. And number three is anyone will be able to participate because of the fact that you can do it from anywhere. And that to me is so exciting to see, our entire society of humans around the world just all operating towards being able to make sure that the overall kind of pattern of interaction will lift for everyone. It's not just going to be for the elite few, and I think that just it makes for a better world. The more we have people that get into the middle class, I've always found like the better the world progresses. So, hey, look, thank you again for taking the time. The reason I wanted to have this conversation with you on a recorded form is because you and I have talked about this a few times. And we're friends, and we chat frequently, and we're working together on partnering together with our products, and that's great as well. But I just wanted to make sure that these kind of conversations are exposed to the world with your thinking, and you're such a great asset to this community right now. And thank you again for joining me on this. And once again, no agenda. I just wanted to talk to Phil and get and shoot the shit with him. So thank you again, Phil, for taking the time.
Super nice to see you again. Thank you, Jeetu.
Take care, brother.